Welcome to the Atheists of Florida YouTube channel. We are pleased to offer some of the most significant speakers and profound issues of our times. If you like today's video, please hit the like button. If you have already subscribed, thank you. If not, you know what to do.
As you go along.
Yeah.
So as you noted, Heacock is my surname, Dr. Clint Heacock. I'm doing the Mindshift Podcast. You can follow me on Twitter at Mindshift 2018. You can also send me an email. If you go to Facebook, there's a Mindshift Podcast Facebook page. If you have any thoughts or comments on this or any other episode, you can go there. You can also look at my website, mindshiftpodcast.co.uk. And I've got all my archives, or all my podcasts archived there, probably going back about 6 or 7 years I've been doing this show. So there's a lot of ways you can get a hold of me on social media there. All right. So since I'm a teacher by trade, I can't help but do some learning outcomes. What are we going to look at today? We're going to be looking at the history of biblical patriarchy in general. And I was interested when Ed talked about being a former Muslim. We'll talk a little bit about that. It's not just restricted to Christianity, for sure. And then second, we want to look at what's called the complementarian view, and then contrast it to what are called egalitarian and biblical patriarchy positions. And that's basically an overview of positions within Christianity. Now, as a former evangelical, I did my seminary degree in theology. I studied this stuff in seminary, so I know the position, what they would have argued, as an evangelical. So I'm not pro those views. I'm just going to give you an overview. And then we want to talk about some of the leading evangelicals who hold to these views, some of their influences. I mentioned Doug Wilson already. And then finally, we want to look at some of the damaging legacies of Christian patriarchy. I've done a lot of episodes on my show talking to survivors who've come out of things like Christian homeschooling movement and things like that. Women especially have been damaged in this sort of culture or tradition. So we'll talk about some of the things that come out of that. So looking at biblical patriarchy in general, we noted that, as Ed said, all three so-called Abrahamic religions, they're deeply patriarchal at their core. It's not just limited to Christianity. It's Islam, Judaism, and Christianity as well. And that's an image I'm sure you'll know. It's from the news recently. We're seeing in places like Iran, where women are getting into increasing trouble for wanting to take their hijabs off and getting I guess in some cases being beaten and even murdered for it, raped in police stations. So it's not limited to Christianity. But in terms of Christianity, we see all the way through the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, it consistently portrays a patriarchal society in which men ruled and women were subservient. In fact, there's an interesting quote I came across. Wolfhart Pannenberg, who's a theologian, German theologian. The biblical tradition, he says, has legitimized a patriarchal order of the family in not only the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament as well. So it goes right through the whole Bible. It's not just an Old Testament thing, it's a New Testament thing as well. And I'll show you some verses in a minute. And we see the Apostle Paul. This is probably the template for most modern sort of patriarchal movements, not just in the Old Testament, but he lays out in a number of places in the New Testament a patriarchal or headship model for the family as well as for church government. And some of the classic verses you may be familiar with if you're familiar with evangelicalism or the church at all. Ephesians 5:22-24, Paul says that men are to lead in the home as well as in the church. They're supposed to be in charge of churches. Women are to submit to their husbands as unto the Lord. We see those kind of verses cited all over the place in evangelical churches. Submit to your husbands or be subject to your husbands. And there's some other aspects to this that Paul talks about in places like 1 Timothy 2. Women are supposed to dress modestly, be silent in the church. They cannot hold positions of authority over a man in the church, but they must be submissive. And there's a quote here that is kind of funny. The pastor speaking, if there's something they wish to know, they should. And notice the woman, she's got a head covering on. She says, honey, I'll explain later at home. But that's actually what Paul teaches in the gospel. And I found this image on Google that this guy's got a real serious issue, doesn't he? He's actually plastered all over the back of his truck. Women shall be silent and submissive. Read your Bible. God said it. I believe it. He's got crosses everywhere. And I noticed he's got 1 Corinthians 14:34. Now, if you feel so strongly about this view that you're going to plaster it all over the back of your truck and drive around town pushing this patriarchal view, what does he mean, 1 Corinthians 14:34? So I looked it up, and this is what Paul said. He said, let your women keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but they are to be submissive, as the law also says. So it goes right back to the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. And if they want to learn something, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is shameful for women to speak in church. And that's 1 Corinthians 14. So this is shot right through not just the Old Testament, but the New Testament as well. Very patriarchal sort of narrative or culture. So as I mentioned, there's a couple of different views. And what I found is that they tend to go on a continuum or a scale from the more liberal on the left-hand side as we get down into the more fundamentalist on the right-hand side, starting with the egalitarian view. And that tends to be in more your liberal churches. What you find here is they believe that, of course, they would subscribe to the creation myth, creation story. God created men and women equal in the Garden of Eden. And they would say there's no gender-based limitation. So in this view, you'll find in egalitarian churches, which are more liberal churches, you'll find women pastors, women elders, preachers, teachers, that sort of thing. They're going to be more open. So I think it's fair to say, someone asked me this question, I was on a podcast earlier today. We were talking about this issue of patriarchy. And they said, do all Christians suppress women? Do all churches suppress women? I said, no, I'm not a Christian. I'm not an apologist for Christianity. But to be fair, there are some traditions within Christianity that are more pro-women, and that would be more your egalitarian view. So it's not all bad. I'm not going to say let's go to a liberal church, but it's not all as bad as we think. Now, when we get toward the more conservative side, we get into this view called the complementarian view, and that's becoming a more of a conservative thing. Now, they agree with egalitarians, men and women are created equal, but that's where they stop sort of agreeing. They would say this is where the word complementarian comes from, that men and women are to, quote, complement each other. So there's various roles. And what are these roles? Well, those are things like in marriage, family life, church leadership. There are certain roles the man must fulfill, certain roles the woman must fulfill, and that includes married life, family life, and the church. So in this complementarian view, they would go along with what Paul said. They'd say women can't be elders, pastors, or teachers of men. So you'll find oftentimes in these sort of churches that women aren't allowed to preach or teach from the front, from the pulpit, as it were, but they're allowed to teach things like Sunday school, like children, or women's classes. They can teach other women, but they just can't preach to men or teach men. And you find in this view that basically women are supposed to submit, men are to be, quote unquote, servant leaders, right? And then I'm trying to think, I've got to see this. Okay, so when we get now into the more fundamentalist view, there's actually a little bit of a distinction between the complementarian and what's called the kind of a hardcore biblical patriarchy view. And the goal of this is it's a father-ruled institution. It's a patriarchal unit. It all starts with the family. And basically, it's all about children must obey their parents. Wife has to obey her husband. And this is what's called headship, where she submits to the headship of her husband. And now where we have a distinction between complementarian and biblical patriarchy views, they would say that men are supposed to rule over women, not just in the home and the church, but now it goes into civil society. So men are supposed to be in charge of everything, not just in the church and the home. And in some more extreme aspects of biblical patriarchy, they would say women can't vote, they can't have careers. Some women have to wear head coverings. You get into what's called the stay-at-home daughters movement. I don't know if you've heard of this, but they would say young girls should stay at home, submitting to the headship of their fathers, and then go through a courtship model of find an approved man and then get married with their both sets of parents' approval through this courtship model. And then at which point her submission then transfers immediately over to her husband. So at no point is that woman, the girl, then woman, then married woman, out from under the headship or authority of her father and then her husband. So that's the stay-at-home. And you find in the stay-at-home daughter movement, there are girls who don't have driver's licenses, who won't go to college, won't go to university, won't have a career, because their role is to be a homemaker. And that's all they're ever going to aspire to be and to do. in this movement. So it's a very patriarchal system. And what we find is where this sort of come from in evangelical churches, you find there's this book that was written, I think it was in 1977, George W. Knight III. He was a theologian. He was a professor at some seminaries in, I think, North Carolina. And he wrote this book, The Relationship of Men and Women, What the New Testament Teaches. And from that was really the first sort of layout of the complementarian, this sort of patriarchal view. And in both views, then, both husband and wives are supposed to submit. So you have this sort of headship model, and that's where they would take the teachings of Paul and as well as the Old Testament. And there's an argument within, and this is what Knight argued in his book, that feminism was the bogeyman. Feminism has destroyed the, quote, traditional family structure. So it was kind of a reactionary movement against feminism. And you can see if that's coming out of the late 1970s, this is the height of the ERA movement, the feminist movement, really when it starts getting up off the ground. So guys like Knight, they're reacting against this, and they're saying, hey, wait a minute, we got to reclaim the quote unquote biblical roles of family life and family structure. And they also would argue that feminism has had a corrosive effect on churches and their traditionally male leadership. That's when you saw women pastors, women elders, women preachers, and they said, hey, we've got to do something about this. This isn't right. We're seeing the damaging effects of feminism on the church, and we got to reclaim that patriarchal model. And this issue of family is huge as well. And I mentioned this issue of raising godly and obedient children. This is where there's an overlap with sort of a dominion theology aspect to it, where you have generations. It's all about generations of raising children within these sort of patriarchal homes. You have these stay-at-home daughters. You have these young men that submit to their father's leadership. They marry a good Christian girl, Christian woman. Then he takes authority over their new home. And so the model just is perpetuated. And you see as well in this movement, there's a deep commitment to sending kids to Christian day schools or homeschooling them. And what you find in a lot of Christian homeschooling, it just reinforces that Christian patriarchy model. So you'll find a lot of these stay-at-home daughters are in a Christian homeschool context. One of the women I spoke to, her name's Kate West, and she grew up in a Christian homeschool, stay-at-home daughter model, home, and she's now left the faith, left the church, and she's dealing with a lot of religious trauma syndrome. So it does have a damaging effect, certainly mostly on women, I would say, but young men as well. And I found this quote is really interesting. You can see how, they're so concerned about the family and how this works. They say, if families do not structure their homes properly in disobedience to the teachings of Ephesians 5, 1 Peter 3, Colossians 3, then they will not have the proper foundation from which to withstand the temptations of the devil and the various onslaughts of the world. So there, you can see there's this fear-based sort of motive behind it. It's all about the family. You've got to obey what the Bible says in this patriarchal model. And it goes on to say, this hinders the sanctification of married couples and also introduces confusion about basic parenting issues such as raising masculine sons and feminine daughters. And that's from the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. And you can look them up, cbmw.org, their mission and vision. So you can see exactly what they're concerned about. They're concerned about obeying the Bible. They're concerned about, pushing this patriarchal model, because if the family starts getting destroyed, then you can see what will start to happen in their view. And you can see right away, masculine sons, feminine daughters, they're very anti-LGBTQ. They're certainly they're not going to, support any trans rights or anything like that. They want intact heterosexual marriages between a man and a woman, whatever gender you're assigned with at birth, that is what gender you are. There is no trans in their view, so you can see what they're concerned about, what issues they're upset about. So looking at some of these proponents of biblical patriarchy and Christian patriarchy, who are some of the leading figures? And we'll look in a minute then at some of their teachings. Some of you may be familiar with Bill Gothard. He's the former head of what's now the Institute of Basic Life Principles. You may have heard of him. I was raised in the Bill Gothard. I consider it a cult, but he was the head of that. Doug Phillips is another one. It's a kind of a Christian Reconstructionist homeschooling thing called Vision Forum, and it's now defunct. It's gone away. He actually was caught having an inappropriate sexual relationship with his nanny for years, and in a very abusive, toxic relationship. When all that came out, about 10, 15 years ago. He resigned in disgrace, and Vision Forum has gone away. As you may be familiar with Dr. R.C. Sproul, he's from Ligonier Ministries. And then you have his son, Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr., who also was caught up in a scandal and resigned. And it's amazing how many of these guys end up getting caught in scandals and resigning. Bill Gothard also got caught in a scandal and resigned. He was sexually abusing women. Some of you may be familiar with John MacArthur. He is the president of Master's Seminary, also the head pastor of Grace Community Church out of California. And he was in the news during COVID for refusing to close his church during the lockdowns and insisting on having services, even though people were getting sick and dying. Dr. John Piper, some of you may be familiar with him. He is from the Desiring God Network, as well as the Bethlehem College and Seminary and Bethlehem Church out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. And he, along with Dr. Wayne Grudem, were instrumental in starting that quote that I read from a minute ago, the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. Dr. Wayne Grudem is another one. He's a theologian, and he was instrumental, along with Piper and some others, in crafting what's called the Danvers Statement. This came out, I think, in 1987, and it was written in Danvers, Massachusetts. That's why they call it the Danvers Statement. And some of you may be familiar with the Nashville Statement. That came out just a few years ago, I think early 2000s, and it was written by the same sort of group of people, and it was basically a statement about sexuality, and it caused a lot of controversy. It was funny because the mayor of Nashville, when it was actually a Southern Baptist conference that they wrote this Nashville Statement, was held in Nashville. The mayor of Nashville tweeted out that she disavowed their statement. She said it does not reflect Nashville's open and inclusive policies on human sexuality. I disavow it 100%. And it got a lot of backlash. But of course, going along with that would be the Southern Baptist Convention. They've adopted both the Danvers Statement and the Nashville Statement as part of their platform. So you've got a massive denomination. I don't know how many thousands and thousands of churches Southern Baptists have across the country, and probably up in Canada as well. But of course, we know, if you follow the news, the Southern Baptist Convention was caught in a major scandal a year or two ago that broke a story that over 700, I think it was, pastors and leaders within Southern Baptist Convention churches were guilty of sexually abusing parishioners, and it had been covered up by the churches and by the denomination. So again, we see that thread running through a lot of this. There's a lot of sexual abuse by leaders and people in charge in a deeply patriarchal culture. And then I mentioned Doug Wilson. He is, of course, pastor of Christ Church out of Moscow, Idaho. It's interesting, Doug Wilson, because he's basically created a sprawling religious empire. If you've never heard of him, he's got a Bible college, a seminary, a publishing house called Canon Press. He's got Christian homeschooling curriculum. He writes books. And what he does, whenever he cranks out a book, he hands it to Canon Press, which is the publisher, and they go and publish it. I mean, it must be the sweetest gig ever, because every time he writes a book, it's guaranteed that it's going to get published and promoted. And so he's got a really sweet deal going there. And he's running what seems to be a very controlling sort of cult-like church in Moscow. And their goal is to Christianize the town. They want to take over the town of Moscow for Christ. And then another name you may not have heard of, a guy named Dr. Vodi Bakum. He is the Dean of Theology, African Christian University in Zambia right now, but he was in the States for a long time. He's a leading proponent of the stay-at-home daughters movement. So he's big into the biblical patriarchy and homeschooling movement. And then later on, I'm going to be talking about these two guys, Michael Foster and Brian Salve. These are both pastors. Foster's out of Batavia, Ohio, and Salve is out of Ogden, Utah. And I'll talk about them in a minute, but just some interesting names. It's a widespread sort of a rogues gallery, isn't it, of people? And like I say, there's the common thread in a lot of this is that so many of these guys have been caught in sexual abuse scandals and have had to resign. And you find that is a thread that goes on within these deeply patriarchal sort of churches and denominations. So looking at some of these key teachings, here's Bill Gothard, and he was the founder of what was originally called the Institutes in Basic Youth Conflicts. Now it's called the Institute in Basic Life Principles. And as I mentioned, the interesting thing about Gothard, I was raised in what I consider the Gothard cult. It's actually a cult network. It's nationwide, worldwide. He was hugely popular in the 70s, 80s, and then in the early 90s. He used to tour all over the United States, giving talks to sold out arenas, 3, 4, 5,000 people, hanging on his every word. And he taught about family and marriage, even though ironically he himself was always single. He was never married. He never had children. And yet he was dispensing advice from the Bible for people how to run their marriages, how to raise their kids, even though, like I say, he was always single. And he was caught maybe 10, 12 years ago. He had a long-standing pattern of abusing young women in his organization, which I believe was based out of the Chicago area. And it finally caught up with him, and he was sort of ousted, even though if you go on their website, the IBLP website, all of his teachings and books are still there. So they've not disavowed what he taught and what he's teaching still. He's never really been held to account for his sexual abuse of these women, even though he's had to resign from his ministry position. But it's interesting what Gothard taught and still teaches, and you can see this is the model. It's called the umbrella of authority model. And my parents tried to raise us kids according to this model. And their argument is that it's like these umbrellas, we're under Christ, the husband's under Christ, and the wife's under the husband's authority, and the wife is under, the children are under the wife, and that's protection and providing. And what they say about this is how the model works. This is according to the IBLP website. They say that God-given authorities can be considered, quote, umbrellas of protection. And look at the key thing here. By honoring and submitting to authorities, you will receive the privileges of their protection, direction, and accountability. So you can already see the stakes are being laid out there. If you submit, if you're underneath your proper role, under whatever umbrella you're supposed to be under, you'll be receiving those privileges of that protection. However, if they go on to say you resist their instructions and move out from under their jurisdictional care, you forfeit your place under the protection and face life's challenges and temptations on your own. And they conclude by saying, through disobedience, you remove yourself from God's full protection and are therefore far more susceptible to the attacks of Satan. And that's from their IBLP website, What is an Umbrella of Protection? And it's interesting, isn't it? Because you can see, if you're depending on where you find yourself in this sort of model, this scheme, you have to stay underneath the umbrella that's above you. And if you don't, you're going to be open to the attacks of Satan. I guess God can't even protect you in that model. I can remember as a kid, my sister Valerie got pregnant when she was about 17. And my mom explained to me, she said, well, the reason she's gotten pregnant and the reason she has to sort of like it and lump it and deal with her own problems now, because they didn't help her at all. They forced her to give her baby up for adoption. She said, well, it's because she removed herself out from under the umbrella of authority. And so therefore she was susceptible to the attacks of Satan. And that's the consequence of removing herself. And there's nothing we can do for her now. So they just kind of shoved her out of the home, put her in a foster home, made her give up her baby for adoption. And then when she had done that, she tried to come back home. And they said, hey, you made your bed, now lie in it. And they shut her off. They shunned her, so you'd think, wouldn't they want to put her back under the umbrella, when she repented? But they didn't. They kind of kicked her to the curb. So you can see the damaging sort of effects of this kind of teaching, both on marriages and families and children. And then we've got these guys I mentioned before. You got Doug Phillips and R.C. Sproul Jr., and they were collaborating together for the Vision Forum. And it's interesting, another quote that I got from their site's been archived now, it's gone. But they say, we emphasize the importance of biblical patriarchy. And again, look at what they're afraid of. Look at what they're threatened by. They say, not because it's greater than other doctrines, but because it's being actively attacked by unbelievers and professing Christians alike. Egalitarian feminism, which I talked about before, is a false ideology that has bred false doctrine in the church and seduced many believers. Remember what I was saying, that they're very threatened by the egalitarian view. They're saying it's crept in and it's had a corrosive effect on both the family and the church. And they go on to say, in conscious opposition to feminism, egalitarian, and the humanistic philosophies of the present time, the church should proclaim the gospel-centered doctrine of biblical patriarchy as an essential element of God's ordained pattern for human relationships and institutions. So, that was their view. That's what they push. And keep in mind, Vision Forum, like I said, was a massive Christian homeschooling network. They had, curriculum and all sorts of content that went out to Christian homeschooling families. And this was the kind of stuff they were promoting. They were pushing a dominionist sort of biblical patriarchy model for not just the family, but all human relationships, as well as, and they say that's how God has set it up. That's what we're just doing, what God's, telling us to do. There's a little bit more from the Vision Forum I thought you might find interesting. They talk about some of these tenets of biblical patriarchy. They say that male leadership in the home carries over into the church. Only men are permitted to hold the ruling office in the church. A God-honoring society will likewise prefer male leadership in civil and other spheres as an application of and support for God's order in the formative institutions of family and church. And they've got a Bible verse to cite it. So they're going to take it in the biblical patriarchy model, not just in the home and the church. They're going to say in civil society, we want men to be in charge, and that's the formative institution. And then they go on to say, number 13, since the woman was created as a helper to her husband, and that's taken from the Genesis account in the Garden of Eden, as the bearer of children and as a, quote, keeper at home, the God-ordained and proper sphere of dominion for a wife is the household, and that which is connected with the home, although her domestic calling, they do admit, as a representative of and helper to her husband, may well involve activity in the marketplace and larger community. They got a bunch of Bible verses again. So you can see this biblical patriarchy model. They would say that taking dominion starts in the sphere of the family, and that involves a patriarchal model. The wife has to submit to her husband, and they do admit, yeah, okay, she can go out and get involved in some aspects of the marketplace, but they would discourage her from having a career and in some cases even voting. Some would say, well, it's legal for women to vote, according to the law, but what they should do is vote according to what their husband tells them to vote. So they have to vote for the candidate that their husband tells them to vote for. So that's the Vision Forum, Tenets of Biblical Patriarchy. And then, of course, I mentioned Doug Wilson. He said some really disturbing things. One of his books, Her Hand in Marriage, he said, women inescapably need godly masculine protection against ungodly masculine harassment. Women who refuse protection from their fathers and husbands must seek it from the police. Now, this is the truly disturbing quote here. He says, but women who genuinely insist on no masculine protection are really women who tacitly agree on the propriety of rape. So he's gotten into a lot of trouble for this comment, and he's never disavowed it, though. Keep in mind, this is a pastor of a church. He's a pastor of a church in Moscow. And he's basically saying, it kind of goes back to that Bill Gothard model. If you, as a woman, remove yourself from the protection of your father or husband, if you're single, you're under the authority of your father. If you get raped, it's basically your fault. I can't read it any other way. I mean, I don't know if anyone can see this any other way. You're actually agreeing as a woman. You're saying, I'm going to open myself up to rape. And if I am raped, it's because I removed myself out from underneath the protection of my husband or father or brothers or something like that. If I get raped, it's my fault. And that's a horrifying statement, isn't it? And then he had another statement. He said, but in the general scheme of things, the Apostle Paul wants the women to make the sandwiches. And this is one of his blog posts on the use of women. And you see this, I've seen comments like this. I heard this when I was in Bible college, go make me a sandwich, speaking to their wife, quote unquote, jokingly. But this is where they get that kind of thing, Christian men, women are there to make the sandwiches for the men. That's kind of that domestic role. And basically saying that's how Paul sees it. The Apostle Paul, women are supposed to make the sandwiches for the men, and they should know their roles, so that's Doug Wilson. Here's another quote. Some of you may recognize this guy. This is Dr. John Piper. I mentioned him earlier, from Bethlehem Seminary and the Desiring God Network. And he's an affiliate of Doug Wilson. If you look at the Desiring God Network blog or website, you'll find articles by Doug Wilson and other leading sort of Christian patriarchy guys on their site. So they platform him. He's been on podcasts with Piper. He's been on YouTube shows. So Piper has no problem platforming Doug Wilson. And there was a video a couple years ago, maybe 10 years ago now, about should women submit to abuse? Should Christian women submit to abuse? And this was like, ask Dr. John Piper, what does John Piper have to say? And the question was, should a Christian woman submit to abuse? And he says in this YouTube clip, he says, part of the answer to the question of should a woman submit to abuse He says it's clearly going to depend on what kind of abuse we're dealing with here. Now, he's kind of weaseling out of this a little bit. So he says, if this man, so he's talking about her Christian husband, for example, is calling her to engage in abusive acts willingly, group sex or something really weird, bizarre, harmful, that clearly would be sin. Then the way she submits, and I really think this is possible, it's kind of paradoxical, she's not going to go there. I'm saying no, she's not going to do what Jesus would disapprove, even though the husband is asking her to do it. So at first, it seems like John Piper is saying, should a woman submit to her husband in a Christian marriage? No. If he asks her to engage in group sex or go swinging or whatever, she can stand up. She can say no, because it's what, so, okay, you go, well, with John Piper, you're saying that the woman shouldn't submit. No. He goes on to say, she's going to say, however, something like, honey, I want so much to follow you as my leader. Can you imagine a woman saying this, I want so much to follow you as my leader. I think God calls me to do that. And I would love to do that. It would be sweet to me if I could enjoy your leadership. And so then she would say, but if you would ask me to do this, require this of me, then I can't go there. So you go, okay, Piper's standing up for women. If he wants her to do something that's a sinful activity, she has every right to not submit. But then here's the really disturbing quote. He says, now that's one kind of situation. Just a word on the other kind. We're talking about physical abuse. If it's not requiring her to sin, but simply hurting her, then I think she endures verbal abuse for a season. She endures perhaps being smacked one night, and then she seeks help from the church. And you can watch that video on YouTube. Just do a search on it, John Piper. It's longer than that. This is just the kind of the controversial side. And this again received a huge amount of backlash because as Piper, I can't read it any other way. If you're a woman, a wife, Christian marriage, and your husband is hurting you verbally, you're supposed to submit to, I guess, a season, however long that is. If you're being smacked and beaten, put up with it for one night and then go seek help from the church. That's hugely disturbing, but you're not sinning by being beaten. I guess, that's how I can only read it. It's crazy. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in a bit later, but there's been examples. And the problem with what Piper says, aside from the content of his comment, is that there have been cases at Bethlehem Church and other places where women in his church were being abused physically, verbally, emotionally, did go to seek help from the church, and they were told to submit to their abusive husband. So his own words here don't even fly. The church isn't going to help you in a patriarchal culture. They're probably going to tell you, you need to go back and submit to your husband, even though he's abusing you. So it's extremely problematic, isn't it? So some of the disturbing trends I mentioned before, Michael Foster and Brian Salve, this is where it kind of led me into this whole thing. I saw on Twitter toward the end of last year, this 21 convention. And what really caught my eye on it was I saw Pastor Michael Foster. He was speaking, and I said, what in the hell is a 21 convention? And why is it a church thing? What is it? The future is patriarchy. I thought it was a Christian thing, Well, it turns out there's a guy named Anthony Dream Johnson. You can look him up on Twitter. He's the head of the 21 convention. They've done this numerous times. It was held in Orlando in October, I think it was, of 2022. And they had not one, but two pastors. It's a completely secular event, and it's a manosphere event. He's like the king of the manosphere. He hosts a podcast called the Red Pill Podcast. And so he's a big sort of mover and shaker in the manosphere community. And I'm thinking, why in the world is two pastors invited to speak at a secular manosphere, sort of misogynistic, anti-women convention? So I started doing some digging in this, and I come to find that both Michael Foster and the other guy, Brian Salve, are affiliates with Doug Wilson. So they're in that patriarchal community already. So this is what's interesting. Okay. So they were featured as speakers at this 21 convention back in 2022. They're both affiliated with Doug Wilson. If you just go on YouTube, look up Doug Wilson and Michael Foster, you'll find many YouTube videos that they've done together talking about patriarchy. I think Michael Foster does this thing. His ministry is called It's Good to Be a Man. And he's got a book on it. He's got, podcasts and all that. So he's been on Doug Wilson's show. He's talked to Doug Wilson many times about how it's good to be a man, a Christian man taking dominion. And this is the thing, it's a manosphere event. Now, I don't know if you know what the manosphere is, but what the manosphere is, it's a kind of loosely grouped series of websites, I guess you could say, online presence. It's a misogynistic, anti-women, anti-feminist movement. And you're talking about the incels, the pickup artists, the men going their own way. The incels have come into kind of the news in the last several years because they've been linked to violence. Elliot Rogers, some of you remember, in Isla Vista, California. There was another guy in Toronto, Canada, where he drove his van through a crowd. I think he killed about 10 people and wounded about 16 more. He was another incel, the involuntary celibates. And they're very angry that they feel like women are denying them their rightful, sexual relationships and things like that. So it's a very anti-feminist, anti-women, very misogynistic, very hate-filled thing, the manosphere. And I'm thinking, why would Christian pastors want to be associated with this thing? Because it's also been linked to the right wing. You can find even links to the manosphere on the Daily Stormer website, which is a neo-Nazi website. There's a lot of anti-women, a lot of the wording and language that they use within the manosphere, red pill, blue pill, black pill, alphas, Stacys, Chads. You'll see that language, kind of like loaded language. And I'm thinking, why? Well, the way they spun it was, they said, this is a God thing. God is setting this up because we're going to go into this manosphere event and we're going to preach the gospel. But the truth is, as I understand it, is that their message was already long developed, this biblical patriarchy message, and it's found a resonance with this patriarchy. And what we found is Foster and Salve, they actually led a patriarchal worship service on the Sunday morning. This is a secular event. So what we're seeing now is a crossover. We're seeing the Christian patriarchy movement and the secular manosphere, and they spun it, like I say, as a gospel sort of thing. But I think it's because they were already long preaching this message, and the guys in the manosphere just said, hey, there's Christians talking about this too. They're pushing a patriarchal message. Let's get them in here and reinforce our message, and maybe we can sanctify it a little bit and throw some Bible verses in there. And this is the slide from Pastor Michael Foster, Pastor Brian Salve. Salve is obviously a worship leader type guy. It's going to get biblically masculine, And this was their patriarchal worship service that they held. I mean, it's crazy, isn't it? You think, what the hell is going on here? A manosphere event with two pastors doing a worship event. And, you can, again, there's videos on YouTube. You can see Michael Foster's conversation at the 21 convention. It's absolutely crazy. So looking at the last couple things, then let's look at the conclusion. Some of the legacies we've talked about already. I've mentioned how damaging Christian patriarchy is to marriages and families. I mean, my parents tried to raise us according to Gothard's sort of patriarchal model. And it was hugely damaging to my parents because the marriage, she was told to submit to my father. But the problem was, my mother was a very strong personality, and my father was a very passive, more of I wouldn't say he was weak. He was just more of a passive person. And their marriage worked really well up until the time they started trying to follow Gothard's teachings. Then the roles switched, and my dad was required to be the spiritual head of the family, and my mom was supposed to submit to him, but it didn't work. And so my mother chafed under that. My dad didn't want to do it. And like I talked about with my sister Valerie, that messed up that whole relationship because, she was seen as being rebellious. And when she got pregnant, they kicked her out because she removed herself from the umbrella of protection and authority. And, I was raised in that culture, a very toxic sort of culture. So it's very damaging to families and marriages. And then another thing I mentioned already, I think girls and women suffer the most in these systems. We find a real emphasis on purity culture, modesty culture, courtship, the whole stay-at-home daughters movement that I talked about. It's very damaging because at the very least, you have to suppress your authentic identity, and then you're trapped in this very controlling environment. If you're a young girl and then a woman, you're raised in this context of patriarchy and toxic masculinity. And a lot of these women, like I say, they wouldn't even necessarily have a driver's license. They wouldn't go to college, university, wouldn't have a career. And if they do get out of that system, they've got to start from scratch. They don't have any marketable skills, and that's a real problem. Another thing is that I remember talking to a woman in Australia. She was telling me that even as an evangelical, one of the things that really bothered her was she couldn't reconcile the fact that as a woman, she was a very gifted teacher. She had strong leadership abilities, and yet she was told, you can't teach, you can't preach, you can teach other women, but you can't teach men. You can't preach from the pulpit. Your leadership skills are only valuable to one sort of level. You can't be a leader, you can't be an elder, you can't be a pastor. And she said, even as an evangelical, that always bothered me, that I had to suppress the true identity that I felt I had. And when she left the church and left Christianity, she's actually a therapist now in Sydney. She said, that's what she does now. She helps people that have come out of these fundamentalist backgrounds, and how damaging it is. It's damaging to your own personality. It's never good to suppress your own true identity. You want to be true to yourself, and women can't do that. And disturbingly, another toxic legacy is that there's been reported cases of marital rapes by wives within these systems. If you read, there's an article, I'll reference it later, in Vice, and she did a really good job of interviewing, I think it was 12 women that had escaped Doug Wilson's church in Moscow, Idaho, and some spoke of basically enduring marital rape, because as a wife, you cannot say no to your husband, even if he wants sex and you don't want it. So he'll just rape you. And so that's what happens in these churches. Excuse me. And as I mentioned, we see churches with patriarchal leadership structures tend to be safe havens for sexual abusers. We're talking about the Southern Baptist Convention, over 700 cases. And of course, the Catholic Church, my God, where do we even start with that? The pedophile priests, and then just being moved to another parish and feeling free to abuse again and again and again. And it's all covered up by the church. And it's worldwide. It's not just in America. It's in Ireland and the UK. It's in every country. And the priest is held up as this patriarchal figure. He's the authority figure. So you can't question him. He's free to abuse again. And what we find, this is a really sad thing, because of that purity or modesty culture, in the cases of sexual abuse, what happens oftentimes, the woman or the girl is blamed and the victim is free to continue abusing. And we see it, I don't know if you're familiar with DARVO, which is deny, attack, reverse victim and offender. And what happens is that seems to happen in a lot of cases of pastors and church leaders. He'll blame the victim. He'll say the reason that she was abused by me, or wasn't abused by me, was that she led me on. The way she was dressed was immodest, and therefore it's her fault. She led me astray. So it's reversing victim and offender. And so that's this classic Darbo thing. And you see a lot of times there's been so many stories of pastors and church leaders that got off the hook because they blamed the girl or the woman, and then went on to continue abusing victims. And I mentioned earlier, talking about John Piper, wives have been told to continue to submit to abusive husbands. And there's a story, if you've ever read the Roy's report, this came out in 2022. John MacArthur, I mentioned him earlier, he's out of California. What he did was he actually publicly shamed a woman from the pulpit in a church service. He named her by name, named and shamed. Her name is, I think, Eileen Gray. She refused to go back to her abusive husband. He was abusing their children and abusing her. And the church told her to go back. MacArthur's church said, go back and submit to your husband, because that's the God-ordained authority in your life. And she refused, and she ended up under church discipline and was named and shamed from the pulpit for not going back. And this story came out just recently again in Christianity Today off the back of the Roy's report, because they found one of the elders at Grace Church in California was a lawyer, and he was asked to look into this. And he said, my God, the way we treated this woman is absolutely shocking, and we should apologize. We did everything wrong. They booted him out. They excommunicated him. So he quit the church. And he said, as a lawyer, this is unconscionable. As a Christian, it's unconscionable. So that's how they treated him, for trying to blow the whistle on how they handled it. So that's what you find in these patriarchal churches. And then the last thing I mentioned before is that the biblical patriarchy message is now resonating with the secular manosphere movement. We're seeing misogyny, anti-feminist, anti-women content that's being sort of promoted from the church into the secular manosphere. So I don't know where that's going to go, but there's some interesting things going on. Just last couple of things, resources. I've done a playlist on Spotify, or you can go to my website, mindshiftpodcast.co.uk. If you want to find out more about Doug Wilson, like I said, I've done, I think, 7 episodes. Some of them are over 2 hours long. There's a ton of content on Wilson. And I get one of the last ones, I think the last episode I did was on Doug Wilson, Biblical Patriarchy, and the Manosphere. So I go into more detail than I've gone into here. It's over 2 hours long. This is the article I mentioned in Vice by Sarah Stankerb, Inside the Church that teaches wives must be led with a firm hand. It's all about Doug Wilson's cult, I guess you could say, in Moscow, Idaho, on Vice. You can find that online. And then I mentioned the Roy's Report. There's a lot of articles on this issue with John MacArthur and the church, the way they handled it. It was not just one case, it was multiple cases. Then, of course, the Houston Chronicle. If you've followed that story, the Abuse of Faith series, they broke the stories on the sexual abuse cases in the Southern Baptist Convention. Go to HoustonChronicle.com. There's some other websites, Spiritual Sounding Board, my good friend Julianne Smith, spiritualsoundingboard.com. She writes a lot about biblical patriarchy, guys like Doug Wilson and others. And then Homeschoolers Anonymous, my friend Ryan Stoller. He's been on my podcast before. That's an archived site, but it's a lot of people who are coming out of the Christian homeschooling movement, and they've written blog posts that are posted anonymously on the site. You can follow him on Twitter as well. But it's really interesting to read the legacy of how this has affected them in this sort of patriarchal culture within Christian patriarchy. All right, so I'm going to stop my screen share and open it up, I guess, for questions or comments or whatever. All right, I see Angie's raised her hand.
Hi, I heard you mention about religion trauma syndrome.
Yes, religious trauma syndrome.
Religious trauma syndrome.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could elaborate more on the example of behaviors as a result of this trauma syndrome. Thank you.
Okay, so what religious trauma syndrome is, if any of you are familiar with the work of Dr. Marlene Winnell, she basically coined that phrase, religious trauma syndrome, or RTS. She wrote a book called Leaving the Fold, which is one of the best resources. If you've come out of a fundamentalist controlling religion, that's one of the best resources for working through religious trauma syndrome. And basically, it's a form of PTSD. Anytime you're traumatized within religion, that creates religious trauma. And so, like, for example, in my case, I was terrified that I was going to go to hell. I was terrified as a young kid that the rapture was going to happen and I'd be left behind and I wasn't going to go to heaven. You know, those kind of experiences as a young kid are very traumatizing. You know, when I come home from school or something like that, and there wouldn't be anyone in the house, and I was afraid that the rapture had happened and everyone had been taken away and I'd been left behind, I was terrified. I was traumatized. You know, so now later in life, I've got to deal with all the trauma, and you go through it, you treat it just like you would, you know, trauma from, you know, like combat or things like that. Things can be triggering, things can happen later in life that trigger you, and you've got to deal with that. You got to work through those triggers and sort of come to some place where they're not so debilitating, you know? So yeah, it's a thing, but I would say look up Dr. Marlene Winnell's work. There's a couple of really good articles that she wrote that explains how religious trauma functions and how it works. I've done a lot of episodes on RTS if you want to find some resources on my podcast as well.
Thank you, Angie. Hamed, you had something to say or add?
Yeah. Allow me to say first, the similarities that I was expecting is uncanny. It's unbelievable, the similarities. But the thing is that, and by the way, I'm not going to downsize any of the historical events that you mentioned or the things that you said. But I came from a culture that what you're talking about is the norm over there.
Yeah.
Is absolutely the norm. Like, for example, there is no various views of religions there. It's all fundamental.
Yeah.
There is no color, there's no spectrum. It's either black or white. And the thing is, it reached to a point that even the victim becomes the person who started the assault of, like, for the rape, for example. Like I know firsthand stories of young women got either killed by honor killing by their brothers or their parents or their father because she disgraced their family honor by being raped by someone, and they
Yeah.
cannot stand that. And the thing is that they get away with it because it is the honor killing is a thing. It's not something that you hear about. It is a thing.
Yeah.
And a lot of victims just did not see justice because of that. And it's that's the only thing is over there still living in that moment. That's the reality over there, and it's unfortunate. Unbelievably unfortunate, but the similarities, man, wow.
The difference is, like you say, in America, they don't have the majority. They're working hard to get it, though. So I've seen the chat, talking about Republican politics and stuff. This dominionist angle in the evangelical church is a huge one because they've been working for decades. For example, overturning Roe versus Wade, that was a long-term strategy that took over 40 years by having Trump appoint Supreme Court justices so they could then overturn Roe versus Wade and then make it a law. So they did get the majority in that case, but that was all part of this long-term dominionist Christian rights strategy that was nothing that was invented overnight. It took them decades, so they're working toward that. They would love to have a theocracy.
Absolutely right. And one more thing, if you allow me, that speaking about the umbrella of religion, and then the husband, and then the wife, the kids. It's sure that if you go outside this umbrella, you are allowing devil attack you.
Yeah.
And the irony of that, it will be by the hands of those believers. And this is exactly what happened to me 13 years ago, is that I discussed things about atheism, about what I just recently discovered. And 2 weeks later, I got, jumped by two strangers yelling all like Allahu Akbar and stuff like that at me, and just crushing my both legs down on the street. Well, they apparently were the devils they're talking about. I don't know. The believers.
It happens. I see we got a couple more hands raised. I feel like I'm in church. I see that hand. Are we going to pass the plate, Jim, or what? Every eye closed, every head bowed. I see that hand. Michael, I think, or Judy. You're muted, though.
Michael, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, you got to unmute yourself, though, Michael. There you go.
Yeah, another issue too that many people seem to completely gloss over is that this has a tremendously negative, destroying effect on Native communities, many of which were matrilineal. Violence against women in the United States is astronomically high against Native women. In fact, it's the highest out of all the groups. Native women are disappearing, getting raped, getting abused at numbers that far outstrip every other single ethnic racial group. And a lot of that does have to do with the influence of the church and this whole idea of patriarchy, and the men are in charge. And not only that, but I mean just the social networks are just completely destroyed because, like I said, these were traditionally matrilineal societies where women were taken very seriously, had a lot of power. And now, because, the church came in and basically told them that, nope, women are not supposed to be in charge, all of a sudden, all those social networks just kind of collapsed. And, the church just isn't really cutting it as far as all that goes, as far as protecting women or anything.
Well, look at what the Catholic Church did in Canada with the indigenous people. That's another example, isn't it, Michael? Coming in, taking these kids out of their normal homes and putting them in state-run Catholic schools, and we found mass graves and all sorts going on. So it's the legacy is horrific in Canada for sure, but it's happened in Ireland as well as in Great Britain as well.
Yeah, I mean, Ireland and Great Britain was pretty much the blueprint for what happened in the Americas.
Yeah, they took kids out of orphans and things like that, and put them in Catholic schools, Catholic orphanages. There's horrific abuses there. I see James, you got your hand raised, and then Jim.
Jim, you have to, you know what I'm going to say to you, Jim Young. You're muted.
You're muted, Jim.
Yeah, I'm muted. Okay. I think one of the things that is extremely important to take into consideration is the story that if people are told that in order to be saved, all they have to do is believe in Jesus. And of
That's
course,
right.
what they don't realize is that this so-called free gift is not free at all, because there's more that they have to sacrifice in order to be saved. And one is they must buy into all of this bullshit and hate and inequality, which is so lengthy, it's just, you can't list it all. But it's an enormous sacrifice that people make when they commit their lives to a religion like Christianity. They're buying a whole hell of a lot of baggage. They're not just believing in Jesus.
Yeah.
That's it.
That's how they get you in the front door, though, isn't it?
Yeah. Thank you, James.
Yeah.
Peterson.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for a very illuminating discussion here. And I just wanted to say that a couple of things. First, in the umbrella illustration, there's one umbrella atop another umbrella atop another umbrella, but only the top umbrella really counts to keep out the rain.
That's right.
I don't quite get it.
That's Jesus, man.
Yeah, it's a miracle it works, I guess.
Well, of course,
yeah.
And the fact is, there's no such, the umbrella doesn't exist in the Bible. You can't find there's no such thing as an umbrella.
I think it was only invented a couple of centuries ago. So
it's a completely man-made construct where they got it from, but it just again it reinforces. Well, if you're underneath the umbrella, like I was saying before, it's so important to stay underneath that authority that's above you. It's all about who's your authority above you. Find out who it is, submit to that authority, and stay within. The fear is that you're going to be susceptible to the attacks of Satan, and that's a big threat.
It is, as you say, just another example of the boom in authoritarianism that seems to have taken hold of so much of our culture. But I think that putting this into context, this is largely what the phenomenon that you just discussed is largely a product of a reaction to the feminist movement emerging from the 60s and into our own time. And I think it will eventually subside, because the physical, economic, historical, political circumstances of our future are such that it really cannot survive this whole discussion, and I think that things will change inevitably. And what we're seeing is probably the most severe reaction to it.
Yeah,
but
I think you're right.
Yeah.
So many of the movements came out of the 1970s. That the Christian right, for example, came out of the 1970s. Moral Majority, Jerry Falwell Sr. Bill Gothard was that's where he got his start. And I think what made him so popular right off the bat was that the culture was tearing itself apart. You had the Vietnam War, you had protests, you had the hate Ashbury, the Summer of Love, and all the rest of it. And people were like, "What's going on? What's happening in our society? Nothing makes sense anymore." Here comes a guy peddling biblical answers, seemingly biblical answers to parents, to husbands and wives. This is what God wants you to do. I'm telling you the truth. And he just garnered a huge following, so that's why he took off as much as he did. It was a reaction in itself to the way the culture was going at that time.
Some men imbued in deeply reactionary authoritarian religions were already queued up to take the kind of positions.
There's always somebody.
but people find ways out of it. I'm convinced that the culture itself and the degree to which our technological civilization has advanced will no longer permit people to indulge in these kinds of
I
fantasies.
would hope so.
And
Yeah.
but I wanted just to thank you for bringing this all forward.
Yeah.
It's a lot to consider.
Lot
and
to
to
take
place
in.
within our overall understanding. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Jim.
Jim.
Pat, you want to go next, please?
Hi, I guess, and I'm not quite sure even how to ask this, or if we can really come up with an answer, but I wonder about prior to Old Testament times, whatever you want to call that, prior to early Judaism, where did the idea of patriarchy, how did that develop? And then from there, how did it get translated, not just with patriarchy, but also the kingship of God, the kingship of Jesus, and we're bowing to these kings? Like I said, I maybe I'm not asking it right, but how was that development that it even got into the Hebrew culture to begin with? Does anybody know?
I don't know. I think I would say it's baked into the DNA of the Hebrew Bible for sure. Right away, the Garden of Eden, you see the roles are laid out by God. If you're just reading the narrative, I'm not saying, it's historically true, but people read it as if it's historically true, and it's literally applied, that Adam was in charge of his wife, he was in charge, and she was his helper, so right off the bat, in the Garden of Eden narrative, the creation myth, God sets it up whereby Adam is over his wife, and he's in charge basically of the garden. And that's where Paul takes it in the New Testament, isn't it? That he says, look, Adam wasn't led astray. Eve was the one who was led astray. It was the woman who fell. And Adam knowingly went along with her because apparently he didn't want to be left out of, what was going on. He didn't want to lose her. So he ate the fruit as well, knowingly, so really that's one of the seed beds of misogyny throughout the millennia, is that, let's say, see, women are the weaker sex. They're the ones who led Adam astray. They're the ones who are responsible for humanity, original sin. It's the fault of the woman. Women can't be trusted, so that goes right into it. Men are always kings in the Old Testament, and the figure of God is the king. God is our father, is a father figure, a kingly figure. We're supposed to obey him. We're supposed to worship him. We're supposed to serve him, so it's baked into the Bible,
Right.
And into Christianity.
But those creation myths didn't originate with early Judaism. They were in cultures far earlier.
Yeah,
and
you can
then
find
just
them in
kind
other
of a
cultures. Yeah,
conglomeration of other things. And
I think,
it just kind of mystifies me how it got shifted into this.
Yeah, but I think, like say, most ancient Near Eastern cultures were themselves deeply patriarchal. You're not going to find a matriarchal culture in the ancient Near East predating the Bible. So they were all, you had male kings and male leadership and all that. So the Israelites didn't stand out because they were different. Reading the narrative, they were just as patriarchal as the cultures around them.
Maybe that was more early, like Proto-Greek or something like that.
Maybe. I don't know.
I don't know. I just wanted to bring it up.
It's a good question, though. It really is.
Yeah. Thanks, Pat. Anything else you have, Pat?
No.
Linda, you get to go next.
Hello.
Hello.
I was wondering if I could ask a slightly personal question. How's your
Sure.
sister doing now?
Well, that's a long story, but I'll give you the short version. She and I are now the only ones that have a relationship left in our family. We've propped each other up over the years because she was a dedicated evangelical, just like me, for decades. Her and her husband were youth pastors, and they came back to the church and all the rest of it. Finally walked away from it all around the same time that I started questioning and deconstructing my faith, probably about 10 or 12 years ago. So we're very much in agreement as far as, our views now on religion and life and everything. She comes over here. In fact, she's coming in about July. I think she's coming for a week. So we have a really good visit plan. So we talk about it. But unfortunately, our mom was so toxic. She's never recanted her sort of stuff that she did. I've had to cut my relationship off with my mom as well as Val too. She doesn't have anything to do with my mother. So our family is still divided and damaged even to this day. And that's the legacy of the Phillips system.
How about your dad? Is he still?
No, he passed away about 5-6 years ago, and that was part of why we fell out, because it turned out that it came out very late in his life that he had certainly sexually abused my two oldest sisters, Valerie being one of them, when they were young girls. And my mom ended up backing him and blaming us.
Oh my God.
You know, we were trying to get to the truth, and she blamed basically his victims and said we were trying to, malign an innocent man and all this. And so as a result of that, I said to my mom, I cannot have a relationship with you if you're going to back up your husband who's a pedophile, who abused your own daughters and not protect them. So that was part of the falling out. So it was quite unfortunate.
So Val's your older sister.
No, I have 5. I'm the youngest. She's the second oldest. I have 5 older sisters.
Holy
so I have
cow.
one over her. Yeah. But the oldest sister is a complete fundamentalist. She's like gone even deeper down into religion.
No.
So I don't have any relationship with her, because my daughter came out as gay about 8 or 10 years ago. And my sister turned on her and said she was going to hell and all that. So I'm like, that's it. We're done. We're not doing it.
Yeah. Oh, so it's only you two that are the ones who saw the light. The other 4 are still in it. Oh dear.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Well, it's glad that we have a relationship anyway.
Yes.
I'm glad she's she's doing decently well. Is her husband out of the church too, or is he still a Christian?
Yeah, no, he's out of the church.
Good for him.
Unfortunately, he's gotten into he's like a Fox News Trump MAGA guy, which he's totally not. So they're having some issues there, but you know, it is what it is.
Well, I'm glad your sister got out.
Yeah, she got out.
Okay, where's that? Where's my thing? Huh?
Okay, Joe Reinhardt, thank you. Whoops.
I'm unmuting myself here. Just a little levity having to do with the topic before this, which of course was the temptation of Adam and the fall in the Garden of Eden. And I just saw a major worldwide survey which showed that 100% of men would accept a fruit from a nude woman.
Maybe that's it. They were naked in the garden.
The point is, it was rigged. Adam had no shot.
Yeah, he had no chance.
Thanks, Joe. Is that it? Is that
good
all?
For a laugh, anyway.
Yes. I'm going to go next because I've had my hand up for some time.
Yeah, I was going to say, you've had a hand up forever.
And I like to give everybody in the audience a chance, but since we're going second time around, I have 3 things. One is that it was a number of years ago now, there was a judge who ruled that a man was not guilty of sexually abusing his girlfriend's daughter because she was seductive. Yep. Even though she was only 5 years old, she seduced him.
Yeah.
There was and that was
as if she could
in the local court.
Yeah.
And I wonder, you said that the girls are hurt by all of this. And I just wonder, I think the boys are hurt a lot by all of this too. And I'm wondering if that's where the incels are coming from.
Out of the patriarchy movement?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I understand they've just kind of banded together, aren't they? It's a community of people who are men who, usually white men, who feel like they are not getting what they deserve from women.
Right.
So they've just kind of found each other. In fact, there was an interesting documentary here on Channel 4, I think it was, in the UK, and it was about British incels, because we had an attack in Plymouth, I think it was, or Portsmouth a few years ago. And it was, which is very rare for the UK to have a mass shooting, but it was an incel who took a shotgun and killed, I think, 5 or 6 people. And so later came out that he was involved in this manosphere incel movement, so it's just they're going to find each other, I think, somehow online.
Yeah, I know. I just think that because they think they have a right to women having sex with them, it fits, it seems to me to fit into this whole idea of women owe them something.
Yeah. Well, it's the corrosive effects of feminism.
Yeah.
If a woman has the right to withhold sex from you because she's more powerful than you, then that's the problem.
Right.
They've taken the red or the black pill. They would say they've just given up. They've said this is nothing going to happen. So the best thing to do is to lash out. So this Elliot Rodgers, he's seen as a hero in this incel community. People talk about going Elliot Rodgers and going ER. They've got a lot of coded language that
Yes.
violence is the best solution. They need
Right.
to just lash out and kill as many people as they can.
And could you define what you mean by toxic masculinity?
Yeah, it's just this, I would say it's a misogynistic sort of masculinity, something that we certainly see within the church, but also in the manosphere. Anything that's blaming women for all of our problems, and trying to promote men over women, that's toxic, isn't it? Because it's not healthy. It's certainly damaging both to men and to women, whether you're trying to be an alpha male, trying to have sex with as many women as you can, or just be an incel and plow your van through a crowd. I mean, that's toxic masculinity, isn't it, in many forms?
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Jim Young?
As a matter of curiosity for those of us who think that the whole world is patriarchal, there actually do exist a small number of societies which are matriarchal.
Yeah.
And if you Google matriarchal societies, you can go to a website which will tell you about at least 6 societies where women are in charge of everything. One of those is in China. I can't pronounce the name of the community very good, but it's MOSUO, China. And the women run everything. And the men are essentially subordinates in that community. And they don't even get to sleep in the house unless they're invited. And they only get to stay for the night, and then they have to leave. Remarkably, there is a community in Costa Rica in which women are, it's an indigenous community. The land is handed down from the mother to her children, and the women are revered, and they're the only ones that prepare the sacred cacao drink for their religious rituals. There's another one in Kenya. It's hard to pronounce the name, but the Umoja tribe is a true blue no man's land because men are banned. And the village is a home to women who have experienced sexual or gender-based violence. And then there's another one in Indonesia. I won't even attempt the name of that community. And there's one in Ghana, but and the last one, there is one in India. Now there may be more that I'm unaware of, but there's at least 6 communities in which women
they do exist,
are in charge. And I was I have actually watched YouTube videos on some of these, especially the one in China. Is really quite interesting, the way that the women run things, and the men kind of like it that way. They actually do, because the women choose their sexual partners.
Yeah.
It
could happen.
They invite the guy. The women go out into town in the evening, and they will meet up with a guy in a dance. And if they like the guy, they'll invite him to come home, and he can stay the night, but he has to leave in the morning, and he has no rights. No rights.
Well, I'm not sure that's a good example.
Well, I like their system.
Well, I bet you don't have any rights, James. I don't think you would be happy with that at all.
Well, he has a right to work.
But to your point, Judaism is matrilineal too, but that's not to anyone's advantage. Anything else, Jim Young?
I think we
No,
got some.
I just wanted to bring that up in case anybody's interested in finding out what it would be like to have a matriarchal society.
They do exist.
They can Google that and get a lot of information. It's very interesting.
Thank you. T. Need to
Make
unmute.
sure you unmute. Yeah.
Yeah.
There you go.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Hello, everyone.
Hi.
And so I've been here about maybe about 20, 30 minutes. I didn't get to hear the very beginning, so I'm very sorry about that. But I was listening to everything, sitting back, just chuckling, kind of enjoying everything, taking in everything that was being said. And I just wanted to give a little different spin on it since I'm so different than most of you here, clearly. And kind of, I like it that way, I like a little diversity. So I wanted to share something that happened in my family. And I'll try to be quick because I think you're getting low on time. So something that happened in my family was that my grandfather that married my grandmother. My grandfather was Aborigine black man from Alabama. And my grandmother was a Choctaw Indian, the darker Indians with the heavy hair from down south. So they get together, and she doesn't want to be on a reservation. And he is, was coming from the Navy back in the 20s, 1910, 1920s. So they get married. And when they get married, he's coming from a religion. We're just gonna say, I guess, Baptist or Christian, and that religion spiraled all the way to today in our family. But here's the clash. We've got a Choctaw Indian marrying a Christian because they like each other and they're young. They get together and they're trying to make this work. So as they get married and they're coming to the 1930s, 20s, 30s, 40s, of course, by that time, my parents were being born. My grandfather, coming out of the Navy as a person of color, developed a really bad alcohol problem. He suffered some real serious abuse in the Navy as a person of color in the 1910 and 1920s. You would.
Yeah, can
But
imagine.
he suffered some pretty abusive things. So he got hooked with alcohol, and as time went on, 1940s, 50s, 60s, 1940s, my parents are being born at this time. So ergo, my mother's born, and she has a little bit of the Indian culture left, and she marries my father, who's another Aborigine black man. And my father's a Christian, and my mother is Indian, and she's extremely, extremely religious and extremely superstitious. The sky, the earth, and things like that. So my grandfather is still the leader, meaning he doesn't supply any support to anyone, but what my grandfather would say would go. He could pretty much do anything. He could say anything. He could do what he wanted to anyone in the family. He could, and I'll be very respectful and cautious here with my language, but he could touch and molest pretty much anyone that he wanted to. It was his choice.
Wow.
And most of the family was very frightened to go up against him. And so we weren't sure as kids. I grew up in the 70s. We weren't sure as kids where that power came from, that he could enter a room, be under the influence of alcohol, have the power to be able to do whatever he wanted, say whatever he wanted, and there was no one to challenge him. My grandmother was deathly afraid of him, gave him, I think, 11 children, all my aunts and uncles and my mom. And as he got older, he would lean on religion, but he would never go to church. But he would lean on religion, but he would never attend any type of a church. So because he didn't attend a church, if you question why he leaned so heavily on his religion, but never seemed to attend a church, it was because that's what he chose to do. And because he was given special permission by God to be able to lead because he was a man. I'm not here to debate the man and woman thing and say men are bad and women are good. I'm not here to do that. I'm just sharing with you something that happened in my family. And so as I'm watching this go down, my grandfather started to get out of control. And I mean out of control. And if you were in his circle or in his realm and he could reach you, you suffered the consequences of him being inebriated that day and touching you in a way that it would follow you the rest of your life. You would remember what he did. Some of the things that he did to us children were so memorable that we carry them to this day. So as he continued to do this behavior, my grandmother was extremely, extremely stressed. She didn't know how to stop him. And now my great grandmother, who's Indian, is they're trying to figure out, because she's getting older, does she want to go back on the reservation, the Indian reservation, and live out her years there, or does she want to stay in Ohio where I am? And my grandmother said, no, we don't want her to go back, because she's Indian, but she's slightly darker. She does not want to go back to the reservation. She's going to stay right here. And she did until the day she died. And so knowing what my grandfather was, my grandmother, who was married to my abusive, alcoholic, religious grandfather, knowing what he was, my grandmother was so terrified of being alone with him that when my great grandmother passed away, my grandmother died 6 months right after her. She didn't want to be alone with her husband. She said, I married him. I know what he is. I know he's a molester. I know he's heavy into this religion. I know I'm never going to be able to submit to it. I know he's molesting my kids, my grandkids. I know what he's doing. I want out. And 6 months after my grandmother died, great grandmother died, my grandmother died. Boom. So now we're watching my mother, because both the grandmothers fell behind each other. So we're keeping an eye on my mother now. Like, you're not going anywhere. And my grandfather's still around now. He's pushing 60s, 70s, and 80s. That 30-year span. He hasn't stopped. He hasn't stopped. Now we're having children, and we're having children, my age, we're having children in the 1990s. My grandfather has molested 4 generations of people.
God.
Under the name of religion, he's able to do this. And he would
Yeah.
threaten that you would go to hell. So I'm going to close this up now. So as I wind this up, under the name of the religion that he practiced, he never cracked open a Bible. Never walked inside of a church. Now, if he walked in a church before I was born, he may have, but I don't know that. I didn't witness that. I can only witness what I witnessed growing up from what I saw him do. The power that he held as a man under the guise of religion, the power that he held was so deadly and so threatening in our family that until knowing that he molested a lot of people, and I don't mean it was maybe he did, he kind of, no, in your face, up front, grab, do whatever you wanted to do. And if you got out of his reach, you were lucky to get loose of him. Knowing all the things that he'd done, as he got older, my mother, who was still scared of him, this is her father, rather than hold him accountable, she put him in the finest nursing home she could find, paid for everything. My mother did. And we couldn't understand it as the kids. Excuse me, some of us kids. So, Clint, when you were sharing your story, if we're allowed to crosstalk, when you were sharing your story about what was happening in your family, I immediately, it was almost like a recording. I connected with it right away, sir, right away. So now we've got this divide in my family of he's molested people repeatedly. He has leaned on religion. He has ruined our mother. He's hurt a lot of people in the family. We really need to let him be held accountable. And then we've got the other side who believes, no, you need to pray and forgive him.
Yep.
You are the bad Christian. You are the bad Christian because you're supposed to forgive. You're supposed to love. He is forgiven. His soul is forgiven. And I really thought that was such a crock. But I didn't want to attack religion, but I'm like, you better wake up because I'm about to ride my broom. There's no way I'm going to forgive this, because had this been somebody outside of the family, all of us would have called for this person to have been arrested. We wouldn't have held him accountable, but because he's family, and we can't, and because he's part of the religious, little group protected in the family, we can't talk about it. So guys, I'm just going to close this up by saying I did talk about it and I became the witch. I rolled my broom. I'm not tolerating it. I lost a whole lot of people in my family. No, he did die. And when he died with just the best of everything. And I made it clear, until we change this perception that certain people that are males and women too, but the males particularly have this unending power that they can sit on top of religion and do whatever they want, and nobody asks any questions, and nobody can defend themselves, and nobody can say anything, and they've got this narcissistic level of this dangerous power that's making everybody mentally crazy. Until we can change it, then I must go a different way, and that means I'm going to have to burn a couple bridges.
Yeah, that's what I did.
Yeah, I did that too with my family.
I had to.
It was just too toxic. And
in my case, it was the most healthy decision I think I ever made. My dad, I resonate with what you said, T, because my dad tried the same thing when it first started coming out about him being an abuser. He used religion. He said, I'm going to read my Bible every day. I'm going to go to the church and get rebaptized. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. Total, exactly what you said. He used religion as a dodge to try to get out of it, and to claim that we needed to forgive him for what he'd done. And never, ever, ever, he went to his deathbed refusing to admit what he'd done. I confronted him over it. He never, ever admitted anything what he'd done. It was only because we found out through other means that we knew some of what he'd done. But yeah, he was a Christian right till the very end.
To the end.
Yep.
Yep.
Or in name only, whatever that means.
Right.
He claimed
To
to
the
be a
end.
Christian.
To the
Yeah.
end.
Thank
There
you,
was
Steve,
no formula,
for
you know, just-
sharing.
Thank you. I just wanted to share that because I just I listen to most everyone here,
Yeah.
and there's a piece of all of you in me here. I couldn't take it. I had to speak. I listened to Hamid. I listened to Mr. Peterson,
Yeah.
and I
That's
said,
good.
no, we are all going through this. This is insane. We have to speak, even if we're scared. We have to say something, and it has to be honest. And that way, people know that if we see it happening in the future, maybe somebody else won't have to go through what we went through.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was very brave of you to
Yeah.
share.
Thank you for sharing that.
Jeanette, and this will be the last one, and then we'll let you go. Miss Dr. Heacock.
Thank you.
I got your name right.
Hey, thank you.
Jeanette.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to say that I'm really frustrated with the fact that it seems like the Christians are taking over the state of Florida for the most part, and it's like there's so much fascism and there's so much hatred going on. And just the other night, or just last night, I was driving on the freeway and there was a big billboard, and it said something like, Christians are supposed to love their neighbor, like pointing out that there's a problem here, that the Christians aren't loving their neighbors. And I don't know which church or who put that billboard up, but I just thought about it, and I'm like, well, if everybody sees it, but nobody's doing anything about it. I mean, nobody is doing anything about it except maybe writing on Facebook or, social media saying stuff. But basically, I mean, I feel like a minority, and I don't know what to do anymore because, I hardly have any friends anymore because I don't want to be around religious people, and everybody seems to be grasping onto the cult attitude around here of, the right-wing cult attitude of, we're all, about Jesus, and if you're not, there's something wrong with you. And, it's just like very crazy. It's crazy making, and I've never been Christian. I've never been Catholic. I didn't grow up in that faith at all. And my faith, is personal, but for me, it's almost like, can't we just be around each other without having to have all these connotations and weirdness, because it's just weird now. It's so weird. It didn't seem to be like this as badly. There's always been a lot of Jesus freaks around here, but it's never been as bad as it's gotten since Trump was elected.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everything is just turned upside down. And I'm trying to figure out where to go live next, but I can't afford any blue states. And I don't like the cold. So I can't go to England.
Yeah. I feel very fortunate here, honestly, because it's so different than America. Every time I go back to visit, I'm just struck by how many churches there are, literally on every street corner. In Britain, here we barely have churches. They're old churches with maybe 5 or 6 people in them, and we don't have the Christian right in this country.
It's bad here. It's gotten so bad. It's almost like, with the guns and with everything that's going on, it's almost like I don't even go out of my apartment for a long time. Because, and I just wrote that I am not working, so it's almost like, what's the point of going out? It's scary out there.
Yeah.
I'm becoming like reclusive.
Yeah, that's why it's important to join communities like this, I think, because there are people out there who can help you sort of give you that support. I would say, that's kind of the project that I'm doing. It's a journey for me just as much as anybody else, because I'm coming out, I'm trying to rebuild my life after decades in the church, being a pastor, being a Bible college teacher, blah, blah, blah.
You feel guilty?
I did, yeah, for a long time, because I got people into the church. I got people saved, I preached, I taught, I went to Africa, I did mission trips, I did all that, I preached in slums in Nairobi and saw thousands of people come forward, and I feel like, man, I was full on into it, but it's important, I think, to find a supportive community. If you can't move physically, find a supportive community online or something, a place like this, because there are like-minded people that can support you, but you have to understand, see, that's the thing. Christians, something Christopher Hitchens said in his book, God Is Not Great. He said, the true believer cannot rest until the whole world bows the knee, and that's really true, because these people are driven by the need to proselytize, to evangelize. They can't, it's part of their religion. It's baked into their religion.
Fanaticism too.
Yeah, they have to do it. They're being told all the time to witness, to bring people to the faith. So they're not ever going to stop. It's just part of their worldview.
However, just remember, they're only about 20% of the population.
Yeah, but they're a vocal minority.
Oh, they are definitely a vocal
But
minority.
they're changing all the laws.
Yeah,
Yes, they are in Florida.
They are.
They definitely
They
have
a lot
control.
of power. That
Yes.
small, that 1% or whatever has all the.
Yeah,
And,
it's true.
And I'm always out there protesting, and boy, I mean, and I say what I think, and I believe in free speech, and boy, do I get a lot of backlash.
Yeah, well, I bet. Yeah.
yes, I'm sure you do.
I don't shut up though.
Keep up the good work, Jeanette.
Thank you.
Yes.
Don't stop.
And you're welcome to join our group anytime that we have a meeting. So,
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. Anybody else have anything? Thank you so much, Jeanette, for sharing that with us. It is extremely frustrating in Florida.
Yeah.
Yeah. Linda, I'm going to let you go, but very quickly because
Make it quick.
him go.
I just want to do a fast one. Has anybody seen the live viral footage of the leaked security video at Steven Crowder's house?
No, I haven't seen
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of talk going around and they recording him verbally abusing his 8 months pregnant wife. Yeah, so if you want to see this shit going down in real time, look up leaked footage of Steven Crowder, because he's a YouTube personality, a conservative one, and he does a show called Louder with Crowder.
it. All right.
The unfortunate thing is that if you live with an abuser when you're pregnant, you're more likely to get abused.
Oh yeah. But now she's divorcing him.
Yeah, good for her.
She's left and she's divorcing him, and their daughters were
good.
born. I think she had twin daughters. But yeah, that shows the footage of him being a real a-hole. And he says in one line, "I'll fuck you up. You watched it.
Linda,
I'll fuck you up."
Thank you, Linda.
Yeah.
We need to let Dr. Heacock know.
Just call me Clint. We're done now.
Clint.
I got a cold beer waiting for me. It's time to go.
I really appreciate it. This was obviously hit a very raw nerve for a lot of people. And
it really is.
It really is. And it's something that we have a lot of Christian nationalism going on in Florida. And I think this gave us a good background into a lot of things going on. So I muted everybody. So, but thank you so much again for coming and being with us. You're always a informative and excellent speaker and get us thinking about a lot of things.
Yeah. Thanks very much.
Thank
I'd always love to come back. If you want to have me come back, we'll do something else.
You know, we always want you.
Okay. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thanks everyone for coming in. We'll see you hopefully on the next one.
Yes. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
If you are pleased with our programs, please tap the like button and then subscribe to our channel. Don't forget the bell so you don't miss any notices of new material. We usually post new content every week. See our created playlists to discover events thus far this year, or to see a list of topics and speakers from our rapidly growing and diverse collection since 1992.